Good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. This is coming to you from Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona in the United States. And we're doing a session here for the Disruptive Innovation Festival on using complex adaptive systems for circular economy design and implementation. Next. Okay, great. So welcome everybody. This session is going to essentially review the lessons learned in how we could use complex adaptive systems theories and principles in analyzing a resource loop. In this case, it was the food system within the greater Phoenix area of Arizona. In order to close those resource loops and how useful that was and how we could go about doing it. So it's essentially a practice session, a workshop that was held in conjunction with the Complex Systems Conference that was held in Tempe, Arizona in October of, the end of September and October of 2015. I'd like to do some introductions here. We have on our panel today, Kevin Dooley, Distinguished Professor in the Department of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University. Kevin Dooley is also the Chief Scientist at the Sustainability Consortium, which creates environmental product declarations and does a tremendous amount of work in sustainability of consumer products. He's also an expert in sustainable supply chains, and so he's going to bring a lot to the table here. And he was also one of our presenters at the workshop at the Complexity Conference. And we also have Tom Seager, Dr. Tom Seager from Arizona State University. He's a Lincoln Fellow of Ethics and Sustainability, and he works in the School of Sustainable Engineering and Built Environment at ASU. He does a lot of work in life cycle assessments for the environment, but then also in novel approaches to teamwork and communication for engineers in particular, and the ethics involved in sustainability and engineering. We also have Janie Bohan, who is a Senior Director at Republic Services. She does recycling and alternative technology development for Republic Services, which is a large waste management company in the United States. She also has an Executive Master's of Sustainability Leadership from Arizona State University and a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. And then finally, I'm your moderator. My name is McDowell Martoma, practice lead at the Global Sustainability Solutions Services within the Walton Sustainability Solutions Initiatives at Arizona State University. So very briefly, the Global Sustainability Solutions Services creates customized and actionable solutions to local and global challenges for businesses, governments, and communities utilizing ASU experts, including the 350 plus sustainability scientists and scholars, and also utilizing students and giving them an applied learning environment in which to take their classroom work and actually implement the circular economy as well as other sustainability solutions to gain that practical experience in going out into the work world. Just to give a little bit of context, the Global Sustainability Solutions Services has been doing some work in particularly the resource innovation world. With the City of Phoenix, we developed the Resource Innovation and Solutions Network, which now has members and partners in many municipalities and in different parts of the globe, in the private sector as well as the public sector. And we actually are doing quite a bit of work in the bio resource world and closing loops in that area. So some past projects are illustrated here. So this project, or this workshop, kind of grew out of that previous work in working with different stakeholders and determining that we need to do something to start closing resource loops in the food system within the valley and that could also be applicable to other parts of the world. So again, the purpose of the workshop that was held on October 1st, which brought together stakeholders from throughout the value chain in the food supply system within the Valley, as well as academics from the local area, as well as academics globally that were attending the conference. And the purpose was to investigate how would you practically use complex adaptive systems theories and principles as a way to design and implement closed loop resources and the transition to those closed loops. So it was a combination of theory and practice, and bringing together academics as well as actual practitioners throughout the value chain to really test this out and see how it worked. So the goals of the workshop itself were for practitioners to gain some theoretical knowledge about the principles of complex adaptive systems, because many of them had no previous introduction to that. So very briefly giving them an overview of how complex adaptive systems works. And then as well for the academics to gain some knowledge of the practitioner's world that they may not have had or may not have had complete knowledge in the past, and to use that as a testing ground for the theories and principles. And then as well, just to actually make connections and relationships and give some insights to everybody as to some initial steps that can be taken to start down this road of closing these resource loops. We also presented a little bit of background that might be useful for the viewers here about the food system within Maricopa County, which is the greater area in which Phoenix is located. And in Phoenix, about 15% of single-family household waste is food waste. There's quite a bit disposed of annually by those households. And then also food insecurity is a pretty significant issue and has risen with the global recession that occurred in 2008. The food insecurity has risen substantially within the Valley. And then also we have a problem with food deserts as well in certain parts of the county, where food deserts are essentially the limited access to fresh fruits and vegetables, fresh foods within certain neighborhoods in which the general accessibility to food comes in the form of really processed snack foods and things like that that are found in convenience stores rather than access to fresh fruits and vegetables.
Mick, I wonder how much are, do you think, local politicians and the political system aware of this food item problem? Is anyone aware of any movement on trying to increase access to food in all neighborhoods? Yeah,
I'm aware of various grassroots activities that are attempting to increase food access. It's basically a number of different NGOs, private individuals, neighborhood groups, social justice groups that have kind of these independent activities that are going on. And a lot of them center on urban agriculture, trying to get community food gardens started and things like that. They're not extremely well coordinated. And what was really interesting for me from this workshop was some of the introductions that were made between some of these different folks that are running some of these operations. There's also some aquaculture going on, as well as some hydroponics that are going on. So there are various efforts. They're not generally well funded. They're mainly run by nonprofit organizations, and there is some awareness among municipal leaders, particularly the way that City of Phoenix is set up. Is we have a district system for city council people, and so some of the city council members that represent those areas are well aware of the food, some of the food issues, but that doesn't necessarily pertain to knowledge throughout the entire city council because of the way that districts are set up. So I think there's some knowledge of it, but like most of these issues, I think there's an awareness issue that in general, and maybe from a statewide level, there probably isn't as much awareness of the the level of the problem.
What I like though about your example, your story, is that it's not about pushing the existing solutions into that area, right? It's about actually creating a more sustainable option in that neighborhood and going with a new design.
Yes, yes, and trying to bring together people that are already working on this and trying to empower them through connectivity and access to new knowledge and potentially resources in order to coordinate efforts and help them be more successful. So Kevin, can you talk a little bit about how we opened up the conference, which was an exercise that you ran in order to teach practitioners in a very quick way some of the fundamental concepts of complex adaptive systems?
Sure. So complex adaptive systems is really a way of seeing the world. I think that all living systems and social systems can be usefully thought of as complex adaptive systems, and complexity gives us both a language and a set of tools and concepts to understand these systems. One of the key concepts is that in a complex system, there is no single entity that is in control of all of the behavior that emerges. And we say that complex systems self-organize. In other words, they have patterns of both organizing and behaving that emerge from the way that what we call the agents, they could be people or companies or teams, but the agents in the system interact with one another. And one of the key issues around looking at a food network is to get people to realize that in fact it is a network, it's a supply network, it's not a supply chain. And in a supply network, and we'll see that a little bit with the pictures that came out of our other exercise. But in a complex system, it's the collective actions of everyone that lead to the group behavior. And so I had learned this particular exercise many years ago from people in the organizational development field. And it's something you can do with a group of anywhere from a dozen people to maybe 50 or 60 people. And it's a good icebreaker. So it teaches complexity in a fun way, and it also kind of breaks the mood, gets people out of their chair and moving. And the goal of the game is to get in order. So everyone stands up, and you pick out a few people in the audience to observe what's going on and comment later. And you tell people that your job is to get in order. And by order, I often say, think about the last 2 digits of your social security number. And so the agents have a goal, and then the rules of the game are that you can only talk to the person that you're touching the shoulder of, and that you have to close your eyes. And then we basically, and I asked the audience, how long do you think this is going to take to get in order? And inevitably they say, oh, a half hour, it's never going to happen. And within 5 minutes, almost regardless of the group size, groups will self-organize either 100% correctly into order or pretty much there. And one of the things that observed over many iterations of this particular game is that, first of all, people tend to coalesce in pairs and triplets right away. And so, especially with their eyes closed, you need, if you don't have vision of everything that's going on, you need some neighbors. And so it's a natural social thing in a complex system that we have to pair up and triple up. We have to kind of create these local neighborhoods. And from there, then, we can create the bigger networks of people and groups and whatnot by those smaller groups connecting with one another. Another thing I've seen over the years is that the degree of accuracy of the final answer that the group comes up with is a function of how many control freaks step into the process and try to basically do a command and control thing on the group. Even with their eyes closed, right? They think that they can kind of manipulate and kind of yell command. And they're breaking the rules, by the way, because they're not touching the shoulder of everyone they're talking to. But nevertheless, when those kind of centralized attempts at centralized control emerge, often the group gets stuck and it doesn't come to a final solution. So it really teaches the group that a group can do very complex things very rapidly without necessarily a centralized control system. But to do so, you have to depend on your neighbors and you have to interact with your neighbors.
Well, and one thing that was really impressive to me about conducting that exercise, we didn't end up having a control freak that tried to take over everything.
I thought that was me.
But what's the point you made about accuracy? Sometimes it's 100% accurate, sometimes it's not. So we had, what, I think 2 or 3 maybe groups of people that were accurate within the groups, but then the groups themselves were not necessarily completely lined up. And it just reminded me of this whole idea of frictionless transparency and communication, but total information. I can't remember the exact term in business school that you use, but it seemed to me that essentially there was a gap in information between those groups because people had congregated
got
together.
Stuck. Yeah, I think the way I was thinking about it is they got stuck. They had order amongst themselves, even though it wasn't global. And they're like, you know what? We're just going to hang on to this and we're not going to move. We're not going to change our order and disrupt ourselves to get into a larger scale of order.
Well,
so I think, that happens in social systems, right?
Yeah, it happens all the time in social systems. So that's why we don't have perfectly organized social systems. So it was just fascinating to see that thing that you see on more of a regional and even a global scale, to see that in a room in an exercise in 3 minutes, and how it kind of settled in this thing of disorder within with groups of order within it.
Well, I wonder if in our food system that we see that same kind of stability within, but perhaps conflict between maybe the urban areas of Phoenix and Tucson and the agricultural parts of the state, or between our state and California.
Yeah.
Kevin, this is Tom. When we did the exercise, you told us a story that there were 2 ways that you'd seen groups try this problem. One was kind of a computer science sorting algorithm, and that's the way that our group would try it. But you said that there was another way that I haven't witnessed, where everybody kind of comes into this hive in the middle, and it's really hard to see whether they're making any progress, and then 3 minutes later, they seem to have it all worked out, and they all go to their stations. Can you talk about that second approach?
Sure. So the patterns that we see self-organize in this exercise depend on both the shape of the room. So for example, if a room's pretty long and rectangular, it tend to organize in a straight line. If it's more of a square, people tend to organize in a circle. But it also depends on whether, using my fancy business school terms, they're touchy-feely or not.
Right.
So a tech group is likely to be more comfortable just interacting with a couple people. And in that way, they kind of sort one another one at a time. And they're uncomfortable both physically and I think conversationally with being in a big crowd and being noisy and physically close to one
I
another.
don't think I've ever held hands with a guy for that long.
So I think, the more kind of touchy-feely groups, like a group of organizational development professionals, for example, or HR people, they tend to have this second pattern where they're more comfortable being closer to one another physically and conversationally, and therefore that proximity allows them to organize and share information in a way that kind of tricks the rules a little bit, right? Because they're physically close to one another.
Well, and actually that brings something up. So if you've done this exercise with a group of just women versus just men, do you see different results?
I haven't noticed any gender differences. I would say it's probably more likely linked to their professional culture background. Yeah.
I can attest to that because my instinct was, why doesn't someone step up and be the leader and organize this group?
That would have been you.
That would have been me. But the huge paradigm shift for me is that, as you say, these complex systems don't have a single actor, let's call it, that's in control. It's a network, and And you could see that playing out with individuals that, the 2 or 3 that linked together. There were 2 individuals that did not move the entire time. They stayed planted. They didn't reach and touch anybody. They just stood there and waited for people to touch them. They didn't change their, proximity to the ground by more than an inch the entire time. And then you had others that were very mobile. So it was fascinating to see that play out there the way that I see, from my perspective in the industry, all the different players doing what they do.
So you must see some industries that are stuck and stay there, right? And others that are kind of moving around and trying to connect with everyone.
Absolutely, and there's actors that just try to take their thing and go push it out there without really understanding the unintended consequences of that solution, how the other players might react to that solution, and whether that's really even the most sustainable answer to the problem, or one of the elements of a sustainable answer. So yeah, it's very interesting.
I'd like to run this exercise with students, because one of the things that I notice, particularly with undergraduate students, there's a tendency to say, well, why doesn't the government just step in and make this policy across the board? And so I think that this would be a really interesting exercise for them to understand why that isn't necessarily going to end up with the result that they're looking for.
Well, I think there's a lot of it has to do with the less you know, the more you think you know. And then the more you know, the more you realize you don't know anything. So there has to be engagement into that problem to understand the complexities.
That's great. All right, so we're going to move on a little bit into what happened next, which was Ella Jamison from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation was generous enough to come out to the Complexity Conference and participate in that, as well as make a short presentation on some of the work that EMF is doing in this world. And in particular, she presented quite a bit of information, but a couple of slides from that was basically about the rising cost of commodities, and one she illustrated with food crops, as well as some of the principles or levers that EMF has identified. And I believe this was probably in conjunction with McKinsey as well, as to how to create regenerative food systems. The study was focused on Europe, so there's a couple of those that you can see here as well. And then also she talked a little bit about kind of the areas where work was needed or where opportunities lie in trying to make this transition to circular food systems. So one was, the first one, circular design and production, pertains a little bit more to technical nutrients rather than biological nutrients, so products on the technical side. But it does get into food systems when we talk about processed food and packaging as well. So some of it, so there's some opportunities there in terms of packaging in order to make sure that packaging gets back into the food system. And then also new business models. And we see this a lot in things like Uber and Airbnb, where you're essentially trying to make more use of resources. So possibly some business models in taking food that isn't necessarily selling on the grocery store shelf, but still has value either as animal feedstock or in other venues, and actually creating business models after that. And we actually had somebody at the workshop that had started a new business there, and in that whole realm, where he created a closed loop system in which he was taking food waste from consumers as well as restaurants and businesses, taking it to a farm, composting it there, returning the compost to farmers that then would donate a certain amount of food back to the people that provided the food waste that generated the compost. So he actually created a new business model off of that. It was a perfect example of how business models provide an opportunity to close resource loops and the importance of those business models in doing that. And then reverse cycling, essentially getting waste back into the food system, and that, through anaerobic digestion and composting is probably a good method there, as well as reverse logistics in the grocery store chain process, which we're seeing in Southern California, where Fry's and Kroger's is actually using their distribution trucks to their grocery stores to take expired food back to their central distribution facility, anaerobically digesting it there and using that power to run their facility. So the reverse cycle definitely works in the bionutrient side as well. And then finally, what are the enabling conditions? So these get into things like education and policy, and we definitely saw that in the conference as well, or in the workshop, people coming up with that as some of the solutions. So let's move on a little bit to what happened next, which was Tom Seager giving a talk about industrial ecology and its relationship to this whole complexity conversation, as well as food systems. So Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about what you presented?
I have 4 slides here. The first one is about the evolution of complex adaptive systems in general. We're looking at that now. We're going to talk about an example in the industrial sector of the economy, what that tells us about knowledge, the role of knowledge, and then talk a little bit about what's happening in food. So this is a figure from Holling's paper, Understanding Complexity of Economic, Ecological, and Social Systems. And it's typically referred to as the panarchy figure. We start in the lower left-hand corner in the R quadrant with exploitation. The idea here is that when resources are plentiful, it looks like the economy is growing exponentially. Now, nothing can grow exponentially forever. As we move from the lower left-hand to the upper right-hand, the K, here conservation rather than exploitation becomes important because the resources are getting scarce. We're approaching the carrying capacity of whatever this activity is. We can see this in our own lawns, for example. After it rains in Phoenix, the first thing to come up are the weeds. When the nutrients and the water is plentiful, it's the fastest growing species that will exploit those nutrients to create this exponential growth loop. But as those resources become scarce, it's the species that are longer lasting, the ones that conserve those resources, that will thrive in the upper right hand. The irony of the graph is that the closer you get up to conservation, the more efficient things are getting, but also they can get brittle. When the resource environment is disrupted or when the relationships are disrupted, you can get a release of these resources. This is the lower right hand, the omega, a reorganization, and start the whole cycle over again. So the growth of the whole industrial revolution, the growth of an industrial economy, is an example of how we moved from exploitation up to conservation. And this is from a paper I wrote with a student several years ago, looking at the town of Kalundborg in Denmark. At the center of the figure, we have the coal power station, and then we're showing the material and energetic flows that attach the different facilities and sectors of their economy and the dates on which those flows were formed. It shows the evolution from a linear economy to a closed loop economy. Now you can see that there's a lot of exchanges happening between the oil refinery, the coal power station, the fish farm. There's reuse of waste materials in drywall production. The water treatment plant provides heat and sludge for the production of soil. Because Kalundborg is isolated, or at least it was until about 20 years ago, the only way to get there was by ferry, the kind of island boundary conditions that existed there were an incentive for the residents to innovate in a way that became more conservative of their resources. So we looked at Kalundborg to try and figure out what was it about this community that led to the evolution of a closed loop industrial economy. Let's go to the next slide. And what we discovered was that knowledge is incredibly important. This harkens back to Kevin's game that illustrates the importance of how information is exchanged in complex systems. When the players in the game close their eyes and they're constrained where they can only communicate to the person next to them, it helps us understand what's happening in a supply network. We typically have greater knowledge of those people with whom we directly do business and less knowledge of what's happening several steps away from us in the network. What we discovered was that there are 2 types of knowledge that are critical to this self-organization. The explicit knowledge is the knowledge that can be written down and shared. It's cheap to document and cheap to share. So an example of explicit knowledge might be stock prices. Back when we had newspapers, they were published every morning in the newspaper, but now we can just download explicit knowledge off the internet and get it in Google. The information revolution has made explicit knowledge incredibly cheap. But what's still expensive is tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge can only be gained experientially. It's much more difficult to share. For example, a sense of trust that you have in a neighbor or in a business partner is a tacit. It's a know-how rather than something you can learn out of a book or out of a table of figures. It was the tacit knowledge that we discovered was critical to the self-organization of the Kallenborg economy. And partly that tacit knowledge was available to them because they were a small town in a remote location. We discovered that when employees moved from one organization to another organization, they brought a lot of the tacit knowledge of their old organization to a new potential business partner. When they have kids who are on the same soccer team or they go to the same church, they would see each other frequently. They would feel like they knew one another. They would have knowledge of the operations and the materials that were available at one another's organizations, and they could create new connections between the organizations that were facilitated by this strong level of tacit knowledge. We put over on the right that tacit knowledge is essential to cooperation, to discovery of opportunities, and to the trust necessary to build communication. Let's go to the next slide. So I said I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in food systems, because that example is good for what's mostly an industrial economy, but it didn't tell us a lot about how to do what's happening in food. And here we see a trend in food that is difficult to sort out. Along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we have environmental impacts from agriculture and farm processes, and along the y, or the vertical axis, we have environmental impacts from manufacturing. The trend that we're seeing in food is towards more organic, more vegan, more what are heralded as environmentally friendly options, but also more technically sophisticated. So it turns out that if you want to make fake chicken or fake fish, you're now no longer farming it, you are chemical engineering it. So as we move towards not just tofu, but more sophisticated meat substitutes, we move up on the manufacturing side of the graph. That is, we move up vertically. As we move towards the free range and the pasture raised, we move away from industrial efficiency into more ecologically intensive types of foods to the right. So the worst type, that is the most environmentally impactful food, might be the frozen fake meat dinner that exists up in now it's vegan, but it's so highly processed that it combines the worst of both worlds. That would be in the upper right-hand corner. So these trends in food systems, that on the one hand, the people who are like, we got to go paleo, and on the other hand, the people are like, we got to eat lower on the food chain, are in a sense competing with one another, but they might both be resulting in greater environmental impacts. We're trying to use life cycle assessment right now in the field of industrial ecology to decode these trends in food systems and find the sweet spot. What are the food products that are consistent with the values that are evolving in the developing world, and leading to more sustainable choices.
And that's going to be regional, right?
I think that's true. What we're going to be stepping away from is food as a commodity. One of the things that the information revolution is giving us is we can get a lot more information about where our food comes from now, and it didn't used to be the case. It used to be that all tomatoes had to conform to a single tomato spec. But now we have heirloom tomatoes. We can handle, in both our inventories at distributors and on the consumer side, a lot more information about differentiated food products. Where did it come from? Where was it picked? If you want, you can get a picture of the pickers that, I mean, in some farms, they were, right. So the cheap information is going to allow consumers to make more informed choices, and those include environmental and social dimensions of the food that they eat. That's going to lead to a lot more differentiation, and that might move the United States to more of a European approach. We know what American cheese is. American cheese is awful. It's whatever comes out of the extruder at the, I don't know, cheese plant or something. But when you think about how cheese works in Europe, each cheese is named after the town in which it was invented. It's highly differentiated. The US, through information technology, can probably tell us a lot more about our supply network that brought this food to our grocery store.
Yeah, if if you, I don't know if people want to know some of that information.
Yeah, exactly right. But as they learn it,
yes.
their habits, or they make different choices about the foods that they want to eat.
Yeah, and that's probably the best way to go. And actually, that ties in really well to a question that's been submitted. And just want to remind all the viewers that anytime you have a question, go ahead and submit it. We're able to see it, and we'll address this line so we can make this as interactive as you would like. And the first question was, thanks for the valuable discussion. From an education perspective, what is the latest thinking in terms of enabling this understanding of ordered complexity to develop in learners as opposed to mechanistic thinking, which seems much more prevalent today? And I would probably agree with that observation, that the mechanistic, we're trying to come up with engineering solutions and how can we redesign products and things like that to get to circularity. Whereas what we've been talking about here is more about the tacit knowledge and the relationships and the communication and the circles of the concentric circles of education or of communication. And so does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, I have a reaction to that. We're working with a Montessori school in Rochester, New York. And we're trying to teach systems thinking to third graders. And we thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be incredibly challenging. No. Third graders get it. The people who don't get it are my engineering students. Something happens. We know from studies that Ken Robinson and other people have cited that children are really good lateral thinkers. And then somehow our education system is beating that lateral thinking, that ability to systems think, see connections and shift perspectives, beating that out of them. As they succeed in our education system, they become less successful at systems and lateral thinking. So now at the undergraduate level, I have a systems thinking class, systems engineering class. I have to do a lot of repair work based upon the success that they've had at high school and earlier years in the undergraduate. So this has given me kind of this idea that we have to kind of learn to stop doing the things that we thought were creating successful students and preserve some of the thinking that already exists innately in the elementary school level so that we can raise up through our current education system better systems thinkers by the time they get to me as juniors and seniors. So that's just a reaction. And that's not a movement or a proposal, or I'm not sure how to do that. But I think that there's potential to reinvent the system because I'm already seeing that third graders are able to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think our education system too has been geared toward creating specialization, this deep expertise within a silo. And I know that ASU has worked tremendously to try and break this down by creating more interdisciplinary projects, interdisciplinary classes.
We have an education system that evolved to serve the Industrial Revolution. What we do not have is an education system that will serve a sustainability revolution or a complex systems revolution. So our education system is lagging the developments in our economy and the needs of our society in the 21st century. That's part of my job, and Kevin's job is to bring our education system up to speed.
Well, and I think too that this whole workshop was an experiment in how can we communicate complexity in a very simple manner in a short amount of time in order to just kind of get a nugget of that knowledge out there in the practitioner world. And I think we must have been successful because a lot of people have approached us after this workshop and said, all right, what's next? And they're talking to each other a little bit more. So I think that it must have been successful from that regard. But Jamie, what are your thoughts on how we can maybe do this a little bit more, getting complex systems thinking possibly back into our society, referring to Tom and his observation versus the thinking that we have now?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Tom, that the system is set up for sequential learning. You learn and then you expand the circle a little bit and you learn a little bit more about the topic and more and more and more and more. The interconnections between topics, not so much. So, the chart you showed with food system, helping consumers to have that data, but from a business perspective, so I graduated from the Sustainability Leadership Program here at ASU, and you start to look at the world differently. And what I see is a lot of companies doing what they think is sustainable, but not understanding that there's multiple matrices
Right.
that you measure this by. So they might be doing something that, you know, a lot of people are trying to do zero waste events. But if you have to take the organics from that zero waste event and drive it 200 miles to have it composted, and then there's no place to take the compost, you know, is that really the right answer? So it really is a system look at, you know, what the challenges are and what the possible solutions could be.
So you're saying maybe a little bit of waste event would be better.
Well, you know, I don't think we really know yet, as a society, how best to deal with the problem. And there's people out there, you know, like people trying to go vegan, there's people out there trying to solve a point solution in this very complex system. And so I think it takes generational change to think in a different way. I don't think business is set up to be, you know, a system environment. There's silos of, you know, accounting, finance, marketing. There's very little overlap across those silos or even interaction. So it's challenging, and I think to me, honestly, the way to start changing it is through sustainability, because it's really more those people you'll find a lot in that community they like to be kind of jack of all trades, like they've been in multiple functional organizations and they see kind of those interconnections, and we just need to promote that more and get more people out there with ability to impact the system.
Kevin, did you?
Sure. Well, first I'd say quickly, my kids, I think, learned complexity most probably from playing The Sims and SimCity.
Right.
Ah,
So I think that a lot of, we have a gaming society, and I think that has the potential to continue that innate systems thinking or lateral thinking that's there. I do want to comment on the challenges from a functional standpoint. Being in the business school, I know many years ago at University of Minnesota, when I was working there, we had teams of students from business and engineering school working together on projects. And we had the same thing here at ASU. But I'd done a study looking at the mental models or mindsets of those students. And it was my observation that undergraduate students are the most kind of prototypical culturally in terms of their disciplinary behavior and identity. So ironically, when someone graduates, they don't have that label necessarily around them and they go about their career. But in college, we tell them you're a finance person or you're a civil engineer, and that's their identity so strong. And I think then the hiring world essentially reinforces that paradigm, because they come looking for people who have very specific, deep disciplinary skills. And for example, school sustainability students who have a broader background sometimes can find it challenging to get a job in a regular organization because they don't fit into that disciplinary stovepipe that's there. So I guess I'd advocate that we also need leadership from the corporate community in terms of their hiring practices and kind of seeing what type of opportunities might exist outside of those kind of normal functional stovepipes.
Yeah.
great. So when we we should mention that this workshop, all these different presentations were interspersed with activities that were conducted mainly at the table level, in which we worked to first identify the values that were the values of what an ideal food system would look like, and those values basically came down to environmentally sustainable, convenient, and local. The food system should be equitable financially and culturally. It should be a closed loop system, accessible, affordable to everyone, create healthy and balanced food or provide access to that, and have the ability to evolve and adapt. So these were the key system values that were kind of coalesced between the values that were developed by each individual table. And then we also talked a little bit about barriers. What are the barriers to this food system? And regulation was one that came up, and food safety, with a lot of different solutions that come up, food safety regulations end up being a concern, and whether or not those food safety regulations are actually helping the situation or hindering the solution. And then particularly in the valley, land, water, and financial resources were actually an issue as well. So water, obviously, and then land from the standpoint of there's a growing interest in urban agriculture. So where are you going to do that? That becomes an issue. And then another big one was consumer behavior. There's very much a culture of convenience and cost in the valley, lowest cost versus highest quality. And so that's something that puts a lot of pressure on grocery stores and others as to what kind of food do they carry. And then infrastructure, aging infrastructure, as well as things that are a cross between business world and regulatory, tipping fees at landfills. We have very low tipping fees here, and so that creates, it makes it very hard for some solutions to pencil out, particularly when they involve large infrastructure. And then also a general lack of consumer education. And there are some initiatives to change that around, both at that grassroots level that I mentioned at the beginning, as well as a program that Walton Sustainability Solutions Initiatives has going to inject sustainability education into K through 12 curriculum. So one of the other things that we did then was have the different tables map out the existing food system. We created post-its of the different actors that are involved and kind of laid them out in what seemed to be a logical flow from top to bottom of the food system, but basically allowing the different tables to rearrange those post-its however they wanted to. And the blue post-its you see on the sides there are people that are not necessarily directly in the flow of physical resources, but maybe they provide some kind of ancillary resource to the food system. So it could be like a financing institution injects. Food doesn't process or flow through their organization, but rather they provide a resource throughout the value chain. And so we had people draw out what is the existing food system, and then what new connections from a network standpoint might be valuable in closing those loops. So it's kind of a two-step process. Let's go on to the next. So some of the main points that came out of this mapping exercise of the current food system was that the huge influence of consumers and their mindset and their education on food issues as to the different impacts that has throughout the value system, through the value chain. And then another one was that waste haulers are kind of centrally connected to almost every piece of the food chain, of the value chain, or the network. And then also there have been, in the valley in particular, as there's been kind of a movement towards sustainability, more connections between different actors have taken place in the last several years. And then also there's been actors that traditionally worked in one silo that are now acting in different roles, playing multiple roles within the network. So this was a very active exercise. Some tables did more talking to try and figure out how to do this. And then others just dove right in and started making all of these connections. And let's show some of the results, some of the resulting maps. So we had 5 different tables, and as you can see from one of the networks here from table 1, this was the connections. And this is actually kind of combined between both the current system and the additional connections that people thought needed to be made. But I would say, and anybody can add to this, is that the majority of these connections already exist, that the vast majority of them were from current state. So let's flip through the other ones really quick. As you can see, let's go back to that diagram there. The red was The black was connections of physical resources, and the red was connections that were not necessarily a resource flow or a food resource flow, but were some other resource flow. So food safety inspectors in particular have an impact on all of those. So the red were those. The dotted lines were connections that needed to be made. Okay, so this is table 2. As again, you can see waste haulers and distributors being central to all the network. And then let's go to 3. Waste haulers and distributors again. This one had a few more connections between the different, and a few more actors that were involved. Table 4, similar patterns again, and then table 5. Again, distributors and waste haulers being central to it, institutional consumers being a big part as well. So it was a really interesting exercise from that standpoint, and again, part of the workshop was actually making those personal connections in order to develop that tacit knowledge that Tom talked about right there in the room, so that people could take away a new relationship, take away a new connection, have some additional knowledge that might help start closing those loops. Okay, we have a question again. You know, I'm going to pass on the question for just a moment, come back to it in a minute. Let's just get back to the end result of the last activity that we had amongst the tables was identifying the interventions, the lowest hanging fruit interventions that the different actors within the value network at the tables came up with that could be something that they could start on right away, that maybe wasn't a huge investment, was something that was kind of a short lead time, that was something that people could start working on that would maybe have the biggest impact on closing those food loops. So we see technology and information coming back into play again. So one of them was, the first 2 are actually related, creating an online marketplace that would link small producers and buyers together. And you know, that would also cut out the middleman, so doing a little bit more direct sale. So that was, and that potentially could be a new business model as well. So getting back to the possible tools to implement circular economy. And then also facilitating conversation. A lot of people thought that the conversation was very valuable, the conversation in the room. So where do you create the forum for having that on an ongoing basis and developing those relationships and tacit knowledge? And then there was significant conversation about the impact of policy and how quickly policy can make a change by changing the economic situation and making certain behaviors more financially viable or advantageous for actors within the food system. And then finally, consumer education again, and this came up as well in the question from our viewers. So let's talk a little bit about this other question that came in. My question is how the environmental impact from organic chicken can be almost as high as from beef. That's an interesting one. So I think I don't know if that was an existing LCA or whether that was one that was proposed that needs to be accomplished.
That sounds like something I should try and address.
Okay.
And I think that they're asking that question off the graph that we showed. And this is Dr. Andrew Berardi's work that he did as part of his dissertation. I just want to attribute it to the person who is most expert. And so I'm not speaking for him, but I'm speaking to my understanding of his work. It turns out that the factory cage chicken is a really efficient way compared to alternatives to create a chicken breast. Now, I'm not advocating for it because we know what the conditions in the massive confined feeding operations for both beef and chicken and other animals are like, and they're terrible. They're enough to convince people to never eat chicken again. In my own life, I prefer to eat, this sounds kind of weird, but only the happy animals, the animals that are raised in humane circumstances. So Dr. Berardi asked me at one point to eat less meat on moral grounds, and I've been able to do that as we've learned more about how meat in particular is produced. But if we look only at the environmental impacts, what what he and I object to morally turns out to be incredibly environmentally efficient. If you want a chicken, which tastes great, by the way, that is raised on dirt and bugs and worms, it takes a lot more land. It takes a lot more resources to raise one of these delicious, happy chickens. That's less efficient than some of the highly industrialized mass feeding operations that we have merely from a thermodynamics standpoint. How much feed goes to waste, what happens to the emissions, how much transportation, these kinds of things. There's an economy of scale that comes with confined feeding operations that make them, on that graph, appear environmentally efficient, even if we find them morally repugnant.
Well, and the land use may involve deforestation.
Absolutely.
For example, or biodiversity loss.
For example, it may involve soybean production in what used to be tropical rainforests, which is terrible. So the point here is that when we're talking about complex adaptive systems, they're not easily reducible to single measures of even environmental impact. Even if we take social impacts or moral considerations out, the environmental impacts are difficult to categorize on a single scale. Consumers generally don't have enough information to make choices that are fully consistent with their values about what they eat. And so we tend to reduce the problem of food and what's preferable to us to these overly simplistic, I'm not even going to say measures, but these overly simplistic ideas. We might reduce it to food miles, for example, and food miles is too simplistic. So Dr. Barty did another interesting graph, and he meant to make this point. He put the amount of information available on food labels, nutrition labels, which are often heralded as a success in consumer education. So he said, look, over time, we put more and more information on these food and nutrition labels. Great. And then he put American Body Mass Index on and he said, because we're just getting more and more information, why are they getting fatter and fatter and fatter? Information does not always resolve whatever we think the problem is. And it can be for a number of reasons. The information isn't what people really care about. The information is not given in a form that people can actually understand, or they get the information and for reasons we don't understand, they ignore it anyway. Yes. So the point of the graph is to show the difficulty of understanding environmental impacts in our food system as our food system is becoming increasingly sophisticated. What the danger in the graph is that people be like and say, well, how can organic chicken possibly be worse than and that's not what the graph is. Graph is not supposed to be saying one is better than another, or it's not supposed to be saying you should eat this instead of that.
Right, it's like dimension.
Yeah.
So we're coming close on time, but I want to try and tie two things together here. There's a question about how can you actually apply this on a day-to-day experience or day-to-day basis, and one of our questions here is, what is your biggest takeaway or aha moment? And so I kind of wanted to aim this toward Janie, is what was your big aha moment here? And then also, how do you take the results of this workshop and then apply them from a day-to-day basis in your world?
So I think sometimes you get so caught up in your day-to-day activities that you don't take the time to step back and kind of look at the big picture. So this was an opportunity to step back and look at the big picture, and that's incredibly powerful. And I think in the business world, we see a lot of collaborations coming together on the sustainability front, the sustainable forestry, palm oil initiative, and this tool is actually a great roadmap or structure of how to take a collaboration of people throughout that industry and move them through. The first thing you have to do is map out what the system looks like. It's a mess. The second thing you have to do is say, okay, so what do we want it to be? Agreeing on those goals as a collaboration is really difficult. And then saying, okay, if those are our goals, then what do we need to do? What are the barriers? Sometimes removing one barrier creates a new emerging barrier. So it's an ongoing effort. But to me, it was really being able to step back and look at the big picture, see your role in that complex system, understand who all the people are that you need to work with, because you very likely will not be able to solve it yourself. And using something like this as a way to help you move through analysis, deconstructing the current system and then redesigning the new system is really powerful.
That's great. Okay, do we have time for a little bit more, or are we done? Okay, one more question. So one of the aha things for me was also building on what you were saying is, once you've done that, once you've mapped that out, you've determined the possible interventions, what are those hanging fruit, you can make you can make incremental changes, and that might influence, might ripple through the whole network and create a much bigger change than you had expected. And your exercise kind of illustrated that to me, as to how quickly things could change just by changing, maybe interjecting a new actor here or changing a rule here, and how that might help the whole system reorganize in a different way. But was there other aha moments that you two had that, Tom?
Yeah, my aha moment was everybody eats. Like, we often work in the university on these really abstract or really esoteric concepts, and it's difficult to communicate to the public because they don't know why they should care. Everyone has a relationship with food, and so the workshop makes their relationship a little bit more conscious, and then they realize that they can access what we're trying to do here on complex systems through their own experience. And typically they're like, okay, now I'm motivated. You've given me like a better understanding of the system. What should I do? And this is where the university's like, so the emphasis on like, what's the next incremental step forward? Even if we don't solve the whole problem, how do we make improvements so that we're moving in the right direction? This is the right challenge for the university system now, to say everyone has a relationship with food, where they are now relating to our work, and we are not yet prepared to tell people who are motivated what kind of change would make the world a better place.
So we need to get to work with that next step. And how about you, Kevin? Anything?
I think it's always amazing when you bring together stakeholders from different parts of a supply network. You're always just going to get conversations and discoveries that just don't happen every day, because as we've talked about, your immediate downstream customers and your immediate suppliers, but knowledge beyond that is very hazy. And so these kind of opportunities, which I think university environments are kind of good at creating a safe environment for people to talk about these things, interesting things happen, and it'd be interesting to follow up on kind of the networking that went on and see how that just having the event itself has made a delta in the area's food system.
Yeah, I think both those things might be great next steps. Is creating a forum. This came up in a workshop. Creating a forum by which these connections can be strengthened, and more people brought in from. There were some parties that were missing from the conference as well, and then also following up with the people that were there and say, have you changed anything? Have you has anything changed in your world following this or as a result of this? And seeing how the network may have evolved itself from.
There are definitely opportunities for those changes. It's not like there's nothing we can do. It's that typically universities don't lead. They lead change in the library. They don't necessarily lead change in the world. So that's the challenge for me.
And you lead change by educating those young minds.
Absolutely.
And sending them out to the world.
That's right.
It's kind of a long lead time.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'd like to thank everybody very much, Tom, Jamie, and Kevin, and everybody who participated from online as well. This will be online on YouTube and later through EMF. Look through the DIF conference, and the URL will be there at some point that you can access this. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great rest of the festival.